Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar. And while we have others file in today through our waiting room, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. Today, I'm joining the webinar from the lands of the Bedigal people on whose lands UNSW Sydney stands, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands upon which we all meet today across Australia and acknowledge elders past and present. Well, today's webinar comes to us from discussions that we've been having amongst us here, as well as with community members who are living with or affected by hepatitis B. They tell us about the difficulties and the complexities of living with hepatitis B while also trying to migrate to Australia. In those conversations, we've come to understand that some more information is useful from across the different parts of the world that work in this field, from law, medicine, policy, and lived experience. And so I'm really pleased to be able to join you here with these wonderful experts in those areas. So today, this webinar, both in its live form and as well as recorded form, we hope will be of assistance to community members, clinicians, and others. There will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar. Please do just type them in through the Zoom Q&A panel. And of course, you can always write to us afterwards and we can attempt to direct questions and answers back to those who are interested. You can write to us through our website at www.healthpluslaw.org. So I'd like to introduce first the chair of today's panel, Benjamin Riley. Ben is the Policy and Public Affairs Manager at ASHM Health and is also a partner investigator on the Health Plus Law Research Project. Thank you, Ben, for being here today and from bringing this discussion together. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm coming to you here from Gadigal land. Very excited to be here, very excited for this conversation. It's a fantastic mix of speakers. I'm going to introduce everyone now, and then we'll jump right into our conversation. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Benjamin Cowie. Ben is an infectious diseases physician and epidemiologist with appointments at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Doherty Institute. He is a professorial fellow in the Department of Infectious Diseases at the University of Melbourne. In addition, Ben serves as the Acting Chief Health Officer in the Department of Health Victoria. Next, Lucy Clines. Lucy Clines is the CEO of Hepatitis Australia, the peak community organisation to progress national action on issues of importance to people affected by hepatitis B and hepatitis C. Vikas Pawani. Vikas Pawani is the Principal Solicitor at the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre, HALC, in Sydney. He received his Juris Doctor from the University of New South Wales in 2012 and was admitted as a lawyer in the New South Wales Supreme Court in the same year. Vikas has published articles, co-authored and edited publications, including a chapter in the Law Handbook, and presented and authored abstracts at international conferences on HIV and the law. And Lien Tran. Lien is co-founder and director of Hepatitis B Voices Australia, the first hepatitis B community organisation that is wholly led by people living with hepatitis B. She's also a researcher at the WHO Collaborating Centre for Viral Hepatitis at the Doherty Institute, with a focus on hepatitis B care in primary care. Lien is from Vietnam and has recently gone through the hepatitis B and migration process. She also runs an online viral hepatitis support group for Vietnamese in Australia, more than 1,000 members. Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for being part of this discussion. Lien, I actually want to start with a question for you to kind of set the scene a little bit for our discussion. We're going to try to cover quite a lot of ground here, so to give people a bit of a sense of maybe what it's like to experience the migration process. How might a person living with hepatitis B begin their migration journey to Australia? What are some of the initial challenges that they might face?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's great to be here, and thanks for giving people who went through the process to have a chance to actually share what happened. I guess, yeah, the first thing that we started is the desire, the love to Australia, and deciding to go to Australia to live. Yeah, for sure. So I think the first step is actually similar to everyone, either with or without hepatitis B. That's the interest and the decision to migrate. There are a lot of different pathways, like we know, and how to migrate to Australia. For example, having a partner, an Australian partner, that is a different story. But a lot of people come here in migration, go through the skilled migration process, and that involves a lot of preparation in try to persuade the government that they should be invited. I mean, the person should be invited to apply for permanent residency in Australia. So I guess people living with Hep B and face the same challenge and started the same thing. Although the health examination, where hepatitis B actually formally come onto the table with the government only at the quite final stage, once all the preparation has already been done, a lot of work has been done, a lot of sacrifices has been there already. But actually hepatitis B can come to the person anytime in their process of like research, and then all the readings that people have and then that's why we run that support group, and a lot of people started to ask questions about hepatitis B. And the very first questions many people have is like, I have hepatitis B, can I migrate? I heard that people rejected because of hepatitis B, so should I even do that or that? And then a lot of people answer from their experiences in the past of all the rejections that happened in the last 10 years or so. So many people were shut down, and then actually many people shared from their own experience in the past. So many people said that I was rejected. I decided to go to another country. I decided not to migrate to Australia because it's not. So I think that's the fear from the information that we receive from the community. But actually it is really sad, and it is really, I think, cruel that even people who are supposed to being provide correct information, like migration agent and migration lawyers, a lot of them are not informed and happy to charge people and provide them with the wrong information about how difficult it is, and it may not be successful based on their lack of research in the updated information. And then we have known people personally who are the victims of those. So on top of general challenges and the starting hope, starting like making decisions, starting wanting to sacrifice to get here, they started to hear about the roadblocks, which many of them are not correct.
Yeah, it's a challenging enough process without a lot of misinformation out there. Vic, I'll go to you next. How do people living with Hep B find their way to the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre as part of the migration process? What's their first point of contact with the legal system?
Thanks, Ben. And Lien, thanks for sharing that information. And that's so consistent with a lot of the clients that we see at HALC who come to us for advice at various stages. Now, a lot of them tend to be referred to us from health services. So they might have received a late diagnosis, or they've commenced treatment, and that's how they become aware of HALC, and that they should get advice about the health criteria of visas. People either use migration agents or lawyers that specialize in immigration to apply for visas or seek advice, or a lot of times people do their own research and look online and speak at forums and get that information. And there's a serious lack of that information that's available in those spheres, and agents and lawyers might not be aware of the challenges that a person's health could face. So in the last 10 years or so, largely we'd have clients come in who'd been refused a visa, who'd been provided a natural justice letter, which immigration provides when a person doesn't meet the criteria for a visa. So they've attended a health examination and it's come back a positive for Hep B, and a medical officer of the Commonwealth has written to them saying, you don't meet the health criteria for the visa, please comment. And that's the stage that a lot of people start to explore alternate forms of advice or alternate pathways, and they'll either be referred to us, or we'll have a peer support worker or a health worker call us telling us that their client's been going through that issue. So it's usually at those stages, either at the health examination stage or at diagnosis or commencing treatment, when they first sort of contact lawyers to deal with that part of the process, or they'd be referred to us by, or they've received that natural justice letter. So it's those few I guess, instances where we see a large percentage of our clients coming. But as I said, when people commence a process for migration, often they seek advice from an immigration lawyer or from a migration agent, or just from the internet sometimes, or from the Department of Immigration website. And so that would probably be their first contact to a legal practitioner in this field.
Thanks, Vic. You said that people are sometimes kind of referred through their clinicians or come by that direction. I'll go to Ben, you now. How do you, as a clinician, become involved in the migration process for one of your patients who's living with Hep B? Do the patients kind of come to you first, or do you hear from a legal service? What happens there?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. So look, it's almost always directly from the patient will have seen their GP and has referred them in to see a specialist for this reason. They may well have had advice from a legal service or their migration agent to seek a medical opinion from a specialist, whether that's a non-GP specialist or a infectious diseases or hepatology, gastroenterology specialist. So I don't think I've ever been contacted directly by a lawyer or a migration agent, but I've been but the patient has sought referral, and often that'll be on the advice of the migration agent. So that's how they come to see me and other specialists, particularly in the hospital system and private specialists, because it is something that there are particular ways of providing a medical report that are really important, and particular content that's important to include. It's not something that any doctor would see crossing their desk every day, and so having someone who knows what they're doing and what the ins and outs of the process are, so that you can give appropriate advice. Picking up on Lien's point, it's not just bad advice from some lawyers or migration agents. It can be bad advice from doctors too, and people can get healthcare workers providing them inaccurate advice around, for instance, their ability to work as a healthcare worker if they're living with hepatitis B, or the likely outcomes of an application, often coloured by experiences that are now 10 years ago. And so I think it's really important for doctors to keep themselves up to date with these changes too, because it has changed a lot, even just in the last couple of years.
Thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, I'm keen to dig in a little bit more into kind of how doctors and clinicians, clinicians and lawyers can kind of best work together. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. Lucy, I wanted to go to you first and maybe zoom out a little bit, think about how migration fits into the sort of broader complexity of people's lives who are living with hepatitis B. How might it kind of overlap with other things that they're dealing with?
Yeah, sure. And hepatitis B is a complex condition to live with because it has a really kind of tricky intersection of social and health needs. So Hepatitis Australia runs the HepLink program, which you might have heard of, which networks our 8 state and territory community organisations through the HepLink info line, which anybody can ring up and get information on hepatitis through, but we also do a lot of community outreach. We collect data on what people living with hepatitis are telling us through HepLink, and about 40% of people who contact HepLink are ringing up with anywhere between 3 and 8 different needs just in one occasion of service. So they might be asking us, do I have to tell my boss? And is there a risk I can pass this to my partner or my children? And, can I share food? There's all kinds of kind of complexity around living with this. And then when you add that extra layer of the stress of the migration process, dealing with a new and different and complicated health system, it becomes quite difficult. So we also hear stories of loneliness. It can be very isolating to live with a highly stigmatized condition, and it kind of makes it really hard for people to reach out and get the help that they need. It's also sometimes a family disease, and so that kind of that layer of guilt, I suppose, about talking about, where you might have got hepatitis in the first place, all kind of adds to the complexity. There's also the issue of cost for people who are wanting access to treatment. So we know that about 10% of people living with hepatitis B are not eligible for Medicare. They might have private health insurance. people with Hep B tell us that it can be quite difficult to get antiviral treatment, sometimes covered by their private health insurance. And, you know, if your working rights are restricted at the time, again, another challenge around costs. So there's lots of kind of barriers to access.
Thanks, Lucy. I imagine everyone on this panel has heard some pretty kind of harrowing stories about the kinds of impacts that going through the migration process can have on the lives of people living with Hep B. I know some of those stories have come out in the work that David and the Health Plus Law team have done. But Lien, I'd like to kind of ask you a little bit about some of the impacts that you've heard from people, or perhaps your own experiences of what that migration, how that migration process has been.
I guess the impact has changed significantly over the last 10 years, or like other than that. So in the past, it was not that bad. And then there was a period of time when people started being rejected for permanent residencies in Australia. And that's actually the stories, those experience from people, because it's such a big investment and it's such a big effort for someone wanting to migrate to another country. So all the work that they have done, and then they got rejected, and it has such a big impact. So they remember that. So it's a kind of trauma. So they remember, and anytime they hear about someone else probably going through the same channel, they would do their best, in their best intent, to actually help the others not going through that process in vain. So I think that's actually one of the challenge, is that the change in the regulation, and then very few actually even, okay, so migration agents are not always on top of the change, and clinicians and even people, like we keep updated on the change a lot to make sure that people in our support group are informed about the change. But I know for sure that it's not everywhere. So that challenge of them being kind of cut off because of those fear, and also false information from migration agent as well. And I guess the way that people have navigated that one was probably that. So reassurance is really, really important, especially with the new development now. We got asked all the time in our support group around, okay, I have Hep B, can I migrate? I have Hep B, can I do that job in Australia? I have Hep B, can I? So it's just like that. And even though we share the updated information, the change in the recent like threshold and then criteria, and then it's not generally it's not a barrier now anymore. But no one trusts that. No one believed, because the information is not out there enough. And I think trauma goes far. When someone is traumatized, that stays really long. So information in the support group helps. And in terms of the strategies that many people did in the past to see if they can get through the process. So some people choose not to declare, because they do not want to throw everything that they have done. Like, yeah, they do not want to throw everything away, and that's the life decision. And then some also like, ban Calvi here. So there are people who decided to just stop treatment on themselves, just try to get that in the cost threshold. And then also people wanted to change to another medication, because there was some time in the past that on this medication, people can pass the health assessment, but on the other one, they're not. So those are the challenge, and the strategies that some people decided to do is not, it's the system actually, the way that the system discriminate people living with Hep B, make them do the things that they are not proud of themselves doing so. They do not. That it makes them not being an honest person, just because the system is designed in the way that that is not supporting people. And why people can still work full time, people still contributing, and those decisions in the past that made people, it's impact people, not only the health impact, but also all kind of, yeah, am I being a human because of the way that the system is treating me?
Yes, it's awful. Vic, we've talked quite a bit about kind of misinformation and the lack of kind of updated information. I thought it might be helpful maybe I know that in the other webinar that you've recorded, there's some more kind of basic information about the process, but maybe talk a little bit about what the recent change to the significant cost threshold is and what that means for people migrating to Australia.
Lien, thank you for sharing all of that. Those are all issues that we see our clients go through when they come to us for advice, and I can completely appreciate the feelings that are involved and the stress that they go through. Now, there has been a change to the significant cost threshold, but it's important for me to give some context to what that actually means. So all visas to Australia have health criteria. And the health criteria basically states that if someone has a condition that would result in a significant cost to the Australian community, then they can't meet the criteria for the visa. Now, for temporary visas, that cost is assessed for the term of the visa. So if it's a 6-month tourist visa, it'll be assessed for 6 months. If it's a 5-year student visa, it'll be assessed for 5 years. But for permanent visas, where the conditions reasonably predictable that are treatment for a period, they do that over 10 years. So a medical officer of the Commonwealth will assess someone's health for a permanent visa over a 10-year period. Now, it used to be that a person with hepatitis B who was on treatment could not meet the criteria over the 10 years because of the cost of the treatment. So the significant cost threshold used to be until June 30th, $51,000. And as of 1 July, it's been increased to $86,000. Now, around this time last year, around 1 July, June 30th last year, it was around 49. And so there's been gradual increases, but this has been the largest increase by far, the jump from $51,000 to $86,000. Now, and there's also been a change to the notes for guidance about what the cost of the treatment for hepatitis B is. So that's substantially decreased now. So what that really means is that whether it's for a lifetime or for a temporary visa, a person with hepatitis B that's on treatment and requires treatment, the cost of their treatment will no longer exceed that significant cost threshold of $86,000. But that wasn't always the case. So, the threshold was lower, but also the cost of the treatment used to be higher. So that's decreased as well. So what that meant is that in the past, people sometimes couldn't meet the criteria for long-term or up to 5 years of temporary visas and even permanent visas. And when they can't meet the criteria for the health criteria for a visa, then the pathways to migration become quite limited. So they're limited to certain types of skilled visas or family-sponsored visas that allow for a waiver of that health criteria. And you might have heard the term health waiver that gets thrown out a lot. And that's what that is basically, is seeking to have that criteria waived when you don't meet the criteria. So that increase in the threshold now puts the majority of people with hepatitis B on par with anyone without hepatitis B. There is what needs to be considered is if a person with hepatitis B has advanced liver disease and require a transplant. Now, that might cause two different issues. One would be the costs of the treatment and the transplant might be higher over the 10 years, and that might cross the threshold. And then the other is that there's another part of the health criteria, which is that a person's healthcare needs or treatment shouldn't prejudice access to that treatment for another Australian citizen or permanent resident. And that's an issue because currently organ transplants are listed as under department policy as treatment that would prejudice access to Australian citizens. And again, so if if a person has advanced liver disease and requires a transplant, then they'd need to seek a visa that allows for a waiver, and the ordinary migration pathways might not be open to them.
I mean, despite those challenges, it sounds like it's a good thing that the threshold has been increased. Does that outside of the kind of the outcome being more achievable when they actually make the assessment, has that changed the process at all?
The process itself hasn't changed so much, as in there's still there's questions on temporary visa applications that ask a person whether they've got certain conditions like hepatitis or HIV, for example, and if they answer yes to the question, or if they're a healthcare worker, or if they're pregnant, then they're usually asked to undergo a health examination. And so they'll still have to go through a process where they do a health examination, and then the results go to the medical officer of the Commonwealth. But the result will now mean that they just meet the criteria, as opposed to then being issued with a letter from immigration that says that a medical officer has assessed you as not meeting the health criteria because you've reached that significant cost threshold. So the process hasn't changed so much. I guess the one thing that it's really important to point out, and this goes back to something that Lien was mentioning about people not disclosing their status when asked a question in the application, that can present some significant challenges. And that's because all visas also have character requirements. And there's a particular criteria that a person can fail if they provide false or misleading information to immigration. Not only can that result in a visa refusal, but it can result in exclusion periods of 3 years, where they're then prohibited from applying for any types of visas. So it's really, really important when people are thinking about the migration pathways and the opportunities that present to them, and the various visas that they apply for, that they're always honest in answering questions on those forms, because it's really hard to come back. If you've answered no to the question and you still get asked to do a health check anyway, then they're quite that inconsistency becomes obvious. It can be quite difficult to sort of manage. So it's important that a person seeks legal advice if that's the case. If they've given false or misleading information on an existing application that hasn't been finally determined yet, it can become an issue. And that's why it's also really important that people are honest and disclose their condition to their migration agent and lawyers. And people might not think of it, because often agents and lawyers might not just ask, they assume everyone's fit and healthy, which is a big mistake, because it can cause issues on character and obviously affects their ability to advise them appropriately on the health issues that might present in the future.
Thanks, Vic. Ben, I wanted to ask you, Vic's given us a kind of nice overview of some of the impacts of a person's specific health situation on the migration process. You mentioned earlier stories about patients choosing to stop, or people choosing to stop treatment, for example. What sorts of impacts or things like that have you seen on a person's health who was going through the migration process?
Yeah, thanks. So, and I think, Lien mentioned some of those narratives, and it's absolutely true. I mean, for starters, when we think about health, I mean, if you take the WHO definition of health, it's complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And so discriminatory policies clearly have an impact on people's mental and social well-being. It's not just about the absence of a disease or infirmity. So that's a health impact for starters. When we're talking about the I guess the more biomedical aspects of health, so yes, some people would stop their treatment back when the treatments were more expensive in an attempt to come in under the cost threshold. And it's not just the amount which has increased, it absolutely has, as Vic has mentioned, but also taking it back from a lifetime threshold to 10 years over which that's assessed means that you're looking at those costs over a much shorter time frame. So instead of accruing over an entire lifetime of antiviral costs potentially, it's now considered as higher threshold and also over a shorter period. It really is a fundamental change to the effect that I personally, and I'd be interested in other panelists' perspectives, I'm unaware of anyone having a visa rejected on the basis of hepatitis B. I'm not we've mentioned about the potential for liver cancer or liver failure, end-stage liver disease. But for hepatitis B alone, I'm unaware of anyone having a visa rejected since 2021. So over the last 3-4 years. So those are some of the health impacts. Stopping treatment when it was necessary, people starting treatment when it wasn't necessary to try and normalize their blood tests, or to reduce a viral load that just to bring it in under a threshold. I've seen that occur as well. So people basically having unnecessary treatment is another issue. So I think now that really to really emphasize what Lien has said, the cost of these drugs now have fallen by 90% over the last 10 years, 80 to 90%. So there's the instructions for the medical officers of the Commonwealth in the notes for guidance, but even those costs are higher than what they really are to the pharmaceutical benefit scheme now. A month of entecavir on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme is $40, 40, and a month of tenofovir is about just over $80. So these come in well below the threshold. If you think about that, so the annual cost being $500 to $1,000 a year, therefore the 10-year threshold being sort of $5,000 to $10,000, that's a lot less than $86,000. So being on treatment for hepatitis B is a non-issue now as to meet the cost requirement. So getting the message out is really important because people, as Lien said, people still don't believe it and people are still getting the wrong advice.
Thanks, Ben. Lucy, to follow on from that a bit, I guess, I suppose, it's fantastic to hear, despite this misinformation, that people are now consistently being having successful migration outcomes who are living with Hep B. How do the impacts of the migration process around Hep B go beyond just a successful migration outcome or not?
Yeah, and I think Lien has identified this really well, that kind of long-lasting impact of what used to happen, and changing perception takes a really, really long time. I mean, look at hepatitis C. We've had a cure for hepatitis C on the PBS since 2016. We still have 75,000 people who aren't cured of hepatitis C because, a complexity of reasons, but one of them is the old treatments used to be really awful and it takes a really long time to change people's perceptions around healthcare outcomes. We're seeing the same thing with Hep B. And what we're also kind of seeing is that people, while the outcomes are better and the change to the cost threshold is absolutely really welcome, and anything we can do to stop stigmatizing people on their way into the country is absolutely fantastic. The Department of Immigration's website still says, and I'm going to read to you from the website, it still says, if you have hepatitis B and apply for a temporary visa, your condition might be considered a threat to public health. Now, that's really scary language for something where actually the migration outcomes should be pretty much equivalent for people who don't have Hep B. And so we've come a good way in kind of fixing the rules, but the language hasn't changed, the perception hasn't changed, and that will take time and public education.
Thanks, Lucy. Lien, I suppose, to talk a bit more about this kind of misinformation question and seeing that language on the department website that would be pretty intense for anyone to read. How are there additional challenges, I suppose, to the process and accessing that sort of information for someone who might not have English as a first language?
I think the things that, I agree, when we mention again the language on the department website. So the word like, you are a threat to Australian public health, that would actually put a lot of people off. I'm like, I'm not worthy. Am I a threat to the public health? So things like that. In terms of getting to the information, I think there are several things to look at. I guess firstly, the department in general, they I think they have already had the effort to make sure that the information that are public facing is written in the language that is kind of at the level of like general general knowledge can understand. However, you are right in the point of people. What about people not that good at English and go through the information? Especially, it can be really confusing. That's all the legal terms is not there on the department website. But actually, how to make sense of that and change that into the actions that may need it in their application process. That is another point. And those information is like at the background information, the background, the note of guidance, all those is another level of information that the public would not have a way to understand or access even. So they need to rely on advice on how to. So a lot of people rely on support on how to navigate the process. I personally didn't use any support. Either migration agent, either with my visa application or things around health assessment. Yeah, probably because I am in this area, so I have a bit more of information in the context. But you are right. Information in language would be really helpful if for first-hand information. And I think the purpose of that, I would say, very important to reassure people, make them believe that they can actually migrate to Australia, even if they have Hep B. That kind of reassurance is not available. And that the reassurance is not, and the information, the false information from migration agent, from clinician, from people in the past doesn't help. And then we need to get information out now, quickly, widely about you can migrate to Australia. So actually the point that we started that support group, and it is in language. Our support group is when we say Vietnamese, okay, the language of that forum is in Vietnamese, because we understand that English may not be easily accessible for everyone, but we're also acknowledging that the way that we can only have a small proportion of people who wanting to migrate to Australia. We also had other people. We were contacted by clinicians having their patients going through the process and wanting support, and they wanted to refer them to our group. People speaking another language, we cannot provide that. It's just we do not have the capacity. So that's peer support. Peer support is not only about information, but about seeing people, knowing someone personally, going through the process, knowing that can happen. That is more assuring. And then please, all the migration agents, all the migration lawyers, please, if you can do anything to stop them from spreading the wrong information, to ruin people's life, to change people's life in the way, and then wasting their years or decades of effort in wanting to migrate to Australia, that would be great. And then get the information out there. Language, yes, among those.
Thanks, Lien. I think that's actually a nice segue maybe to go to you, Lucy, to ask a little bit about, we talked a bit about lawyers and clinicians, and I want to come back to that again, but what is the role for the community workforce for people who are living with hepatitis B going through the migration process?
Yeah, sure. So people need pathways and peer support to help them navigate health and legal systems. These are complex and new systems, as we've talked about. And the community workforce engages people living with hepatitis in the places where they live and they work and they socialise. So Hepatitis Australia's members, some of who are on this webinar today, that's a network of 8 community hepatitis organisations who do both. We run the HepLink info line and also do outreach into community to help people kind of understand the system and tap into care. I will put the details for HepLink into the chat here just so people can use it if they need to. I'd love to say that we have the community workforce in Australia that we need, but there are 200,000 people in Australia living with hepatitis B, and so our community workforce isn't big enough yet, which is why things like hepatitis B voices is so important. We know that 25% of people with chronic Hep B are receiving regular clinical care. We'd like that number to be closer to 50. Only 13% are on an antiviral treatment. So that community workforce isn't large enough yet, and we're probably not reaching all parts of the community that we should be. Programs like Health Plus Law are also very important to bridging some of those gaps, but implementing a Hep B community workforce, we hope, will be a priority in the next Australia's next hepatitis B national strategy. And certainly we've been pushing government in that direction, because it's really important that we can reach out to people in the settings where they are and say to people, you know, this is a highly, highly stigmatized and misunderstood condition. It's okay to talk about hepatitis B and ask questions about it. You're not going to be deported. You're not going to lose your job. You know, it's really meeting people where they are and enabling them to talk about living with hepatitis B.
Thanks, Lucy. Just seeing we've had one question come through in the Q&A that Ben has kindly answered. If anyone wants to add any more questions, please jump in and do that. I might throw the next question to Vic and to Ben. I suppose we've talked a little bit about the ways that all these kind of different complex moving pieces of the workforce and of people's lives all fit together. I want to have a think specifically about how legal services and clinical services, lawyers and clinicians, can best kind of work together and interface. So Vic, might start with you. What does that kind of ideally look like for you? What is the best version of lawyers and clinicians working together to support someone's migration process look like?
You're on mute, dude. Sorry.
I think thanks, Ben. I think I'll start with how lawyers can best improve the services they provide. Lien mentioned the issue with the language barrier that comes into play when people are seeking advice. It's really important that lawyers use interpreters and qualified interpreters when they're giving advice to people. It's also really important that they ask the right questions that they need answers to be able to effectively advise people, right? You know, for example, I mentioned earlier, people don't ask the questions about health and how that might impact someone's immigration matter. So that's really important to ask. Now, I guess in migration, there's three larger pathways that people use to migrate. There's the skilled pathway, there's humanitarian, and then there's a family-sponsored pathway. The skilled one seems to be the one that's most complex and causes the most uncertainty in people, because there's various types of visas, they have various requirements. And I think if at the outset, if people looking to migrate to Australia are aware that what they study and what skills they acquire and the qualifications that they get, how relevant they are in terms of whether they'll get that migration outcome or not, that would be that's something that we can all work on, I guess, as lawyers, because Australia does have a skills shortage list and a skills in demand list. And if people are spending all of their money and studying courses that aren't on the list, then chances are that when they get to the end of the pathway, they might not have an opportunity to get sponsorship in that occupation, or they might not get invited to apply for skilled independent visas. There's also pretty strict English language requirements for a lot of the skilled visas. So getting people into courses to support getting the scores that they need, that's really important. It's also really important that people are aware of age limitations for skilled migration. So most permanent visas have a limit of 45 for migrating permanently, unless they're earning over $175,000 in their occupation. It's a sponsored visa. So just a few of those things, if people were aware of before they began their journey, before they applied to university to do a course in business administration, for example, which is very useful in a lot of countries, but in Australia that doesn't necessarily lead to someone being able to get sponsored or getting invited to apply for those visas. So just more skill and better communication in advising people on the general migration pathways about what the criteria is, so people aren't wasting their money and their time and doing courses and getting experience in occupations that don't really get them that outcome at the end. And I think clinicians can really, I guess, assist in that process, at least when they're seeing people with hepatitis B, living with hepatitis B, coming to see them, in referring them to those services. And I think this is where we could perhaps be better linked up to HALC. For those of you who don't know, it's the HIV/AIDS Legal Center, but we also provide advice and services to people with hepatitis B. And we do have access to interpreters, and we are we specialize in migration, I especially do. And so we always give advice to people when they ask for it. So it's about sort of opening up those referral pathways where people are seeking advice to make sure that they're at least linked up with someone who's competent. So even if, we're quite a small service, but even if we can't provide advice or provide representation to a client who comes to see us, we can refer them to someone who we know to be competent, because if they've got capacity to pay, at least they go and pay that money to people who we know to be competent, as opposed to just finding random agents and lawyers from their communities. The other way that clinicians, I feel, could help is there's often strict time limits in immigration to provide supporting documentation and information. And so the timeliness of providing those reports and letters of support that we often ask clinicians to write, that's really important. And we always get assistance from nurses and social workers and peer support workers who assist with sort of pushing those requests through. But that's one more way I think that clinicians can be, I guess, more involved and aware. And obviously attending seminars like these. So, when someone comes to them, you can provide some reassurance that, yes, generally it shouldn't be an issue that you're living with hepatitis B, but get advice anyway, about what you're studying, or whether you're studying the right course, or whether you've applied for the right visa, so opening those referral pathways is really important.
And while I've got you, Vic, there's a question that's come through that you will be able to provide a quick answer to. Can HALC provide advice to anyone living across Australia and work with them to complete applications, even if not residing in New South Wales?
So our core funding is for New South Wales, but we can provide advice to anyone living in the country, and we have some funding, some additional sources of funding, and through Health Plus Law as well, that we can provide discrete legal tasks. We are limited by just capacity to be able to provide representation to everyone, but if we can't provide representation, we can at least provide advice and an appropriate referral pathway, or some discrete legal assistance, which may include assistance with completing an application. But generally, if the hepatitis B isn't an issue in the application, then it wouldn't fall strictly within our operational guidelines, but we can advise anyone.
Thank you. Ben, I suppose to ask the kind of other side of that question from a clinician's perspective, what does it look like for you to support someone? What are the best ways a clinician can do that? And what have you learned over the years of supporting people as part of this process?
Thanks. So, I mean, picking up on Vic's point around timeliness and trying to get things to people when they need them, not sort of 3 or 4 months later, is a critical thing, and something that our healthcare system doesn't always do its best at, being accessible and timely. The first thing I'd say is, for any clinician, not every nurse or doctor or healthcare worker in the country can be an expert in aspects of hepatitis B as it relates to migration. But what they can do is admit when they don't know something and then find someone who does. And so I think a lot of the problems arise when people and they may be well-meaning, have a guess or try and say, oh yeah, I heard about this person that didn't work for, so I don't think you can do that. We still hear people being told things like, you can't be a nurse if you've got hepatitis B. You know, this is happening today, you know, in Australia, and people being told by healthcare workers just dead wrong information. So I think the first thing is people understanding that not everyone can be an expert in this, but they should then admit that and try and find people access to an expert, whether that's through referral to a public hospital, hepatitis clinic, or otherwise. If you're the person who does know a bit more about this and is providing a medical report, there's a few things you can do. The first thing is obviously to reassure the person, and I think as Lien and Lucy have both mentioned, it's a very harrowing time. People's future is in your hands, and their future is at threat. And so that person is under an extreme amount of stress. That might be also causing them relationship stress, depending on what their relationship situation, certainly job stress, and a sense of their whole future being at risk. So you have to make sure that you can reassure someone, look after them and their acute distress. On the practical level, the first thing is, it's often important that the medical report is provided, as I think Vic alluded to, prior to their appointment with the medical officer of the Commonwealth. It's actually really important, because then the medical officer of the Commonwealth, who's making this determination, has to consider what's in that letter as part of their assessment of the health status of the applicant and whether they're likely to represent a significant cost. This is probably not as much of an issue now as it was when people were failing the significant cost test on the basis of being on antiviral therapy, or on the basis of perceived need of being on antiviral therapy soon. So, but that said, I think getting the medical report to someone before their appointment with the medical officer of the Commonwealth, really important. And then there are certain things, and I can provide a link to some guidelines that ASHM have put out that have been informed by some of the people on this call, to give doctors and other sort of medical, or people who are providing medical reports, some of the criteria that should be in there. Things like whether their hepatitis B status is going to have any impact on their ability to work. Whether they can receive care in the community versus requiring specialist care in a hospital, what the likelihood is of that person progressing to advanced liver disease, whether without treatment. So there's a number of different detailed aspects that should go into that report, so that the medical officer of the Commonwealth can look at that and go, right, I'm convinced by this report and everything I see before me, and the guidance notes that I've been provided, that this person meets the health requirement and has a positive outcome.
Thanks, Ben. I saw you've answered a few of those questions in the chat, but I might just pick up on one in a bunch of questions in one from Dion. That final one. Do we need to do more work among the primary care workforce? And I suppose I'd kind of add to that. What might upskilling the health workforce even kind of look like around migration? And do you think that's something that we should be doing?
Oh, look, I think Dion's question is more like, what about just engagement with care? It's not just about the migration aspect. It's about actually getting people into care. To Lucy's point around the proportion in care, the proportion on treatment is well shy of our 2022 targets, let alone our 2030 draft aspirations. So yes, primary care, nursing and medical is a key aspect of how we can build access to care for the 200,000 Australians living with hepatitis B. But we all know primary care is under extreme stress, historic levels of stress at the moment, and people are paying out of pocket to see doctors, GPs. They're waiting, they can have long waits. Their ultrasound bulk billing for those who need ultrasounds every 6 months for liver cancer surveillance is plummeting, and people are often out of pocket a significant amount for that. So it's not just a question of providing training and education. There's broader healthcare access issues, which we need to solve. And it is incredibly cost effective, and it's been proven again and again in the Australian setting. It is cost effective to manage people living with hepatitis B, including antiviral therapy where indicated, rather than waiting for the consequences of untreated infection to result in advanced liver disease and liver cancer. And not only, I mean, that's just on cost grounds, let alone on the human rights grounds and on the individual health grounds, which are absolutely profound. In liver cancer, which, you know, the majority of which is still called by chronic viral hepatitis C and B, remains the fastest increasing cause of cancer death of Australians. So yes, we need to do this. Yes, primary care is key, but it's not just about training, it's about how we build access.
Well said. We're almost out of time. I might just, before I hand it back to David, see if anyone wanted to add anything finally to the discussion. We've covered quite a lot of ground here. Ben, Vic, Lucy, or Lien.
Just a quick note there, and I think this was mentioned earlier about people, you know, in the past, stopping medication or doing all sorts of things to sort of get below that threshold. The test in the migration regulations refers to, when it gives advice to the medical officer on how to assess the criteria, it refers to the hypothetical person with the same condition and severity as the applicant. So it's not even about that particular applicant, it's about what an applicant with a hypothetical person in which sort of similar in the same severity and same condition as the applicant would be what the cost of that would be. So all of that stuff that we've had goes at for other conditions, having people switch medications or not get on updated medications because they wanted to lower the cost of their treatment, and it's never worked. They just sort of blindly follow the notes for guidance. So you attend a medical with Bupa, and then they'd ask you to bring a specialist report, and then immigration will write to you to ask for another specialist report later on if there's any. But really, the number of times you send a specialist report and there's been absolutely no change to the costing. So just to put the word out there that, take care of your health, that's more important. And the consequences of your health on immigration, they'll happen. I mean, it shouldn't happen to most people with hepatitis B, but they'll be faced anyway, and if you get the right representation and advice, they can help you deal with that. But the health part is really important. So just for people to know that.
Thanks, Vic.
That's actually what I wanted to say as well. Just making sure understanding all the trauma, all the stress that people living with Hep B have in the process of migration. One thing that we always want to remind everyone and want us to remember is that always making sure that we take care of our health, put that as the first priority. But I think that's also the call of action to clinicians, to people doing policy, that to making sure that the care is accessible for people. And even though we talk about the barriers that people who are migrating, meaning probably not eligible for Medicare. So that's not only the out-of-pocket for GP or for ultrasound, but also the access to medication as well. Because normally the health cover, the overseas health cover for students or for workers, they do have very low benefit of medication, and they would not cover the medication for the person. So if anything that can be done, I think, yes, please help. So we, from the ground, will make sure we get people to be more awareness of their health and then taking care of our health. But we also need the decision from the system, making sure that it is provided in the way that is affordable to people. Thank you.
Thanks, Lien. Anything you wanted to add, Lucy, before we wrap up?
Yeah, just to point out that we have to think about this problem as holistically and as a systemic problem. So access to medical information and treatment is incredibly important, as is access to justice in this space, because there is so much stigma and misinformation. And we're hoping to see that as an increasing government priority, that human rights kind of justice lens to hepatitis, particularly in the new national hepatitis B strategies, and Hepatitis Australia will keep pushing in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. David, I wasn't sure if you wanted to say any kind of final words.
I'll just say thank you to everyone. The discussion and the themes are so fantastic. This will be a really helpful resource for community members and clinicians and others. And so thank you to Vic, to Ben, Lien, Lucy, and to you, Ben, as well. Hepatitis B is a complex place, but it's in very safe hands with everyone here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.